Okay, this is chapter 1 of Mary Will I Die by Sean Sarles. This chapter at the top says 5 years later. Chapter 1, Grace. So we're focusing on Grace 5 years later. The doors creaked shut behind her, groaning like the crypt keeper's coffin as Grace stepped off the school bus. She watched the other kids scatter in front of her, running to meet their friends, whooping and hollering like they hadn't seen one another the day before, like they hadn't group chatted all night long. Grace's hand fluttered to the necklace hanging around her neck, but she fought off the urge, pulling her backpack tight against her shoulders instead. Freshman year of high school was supposed to be hard. She knew that. Everything was different. Her classmates and teachers, the building, all the electives and extracurriculars. There was a whole new set of rules for getting by, for just surviving, but she'd never imagined it would be this lonely. Grace buried her chin in her chest and started walking, skirting between groups, trying her best to stay invisible, but at page 13. But at the same time, oddly, wanting to be seen. She made it to the entrance, but stopped short as her reflection caught her off guard. There in the depths of the glass doors, her big eyes stared back at her, a message primed on the tip of her mirror tongue. I don't know what that is, the end of the mirror, I guess. You'll never be pretty enough. See how that's in italics? That means that's like a message. Sometimes it's a thought. You'll never be pretty enough. And she wouldn't. Not with her round face, not with her limp brown bangs hanging across her forehead, not with her pudgy cheeks and shapeless body. She took a step back so she could see it all, running her palms over her rumpled Mistress of the Dark t-shirt, smoothing out Elvira's bouffanted head and bright red lipstick. But not even the mistress could take away the sting, the ugly feeling of being ugly. This time Grace couldn't fight it. Her hand flew to her neck and snagged on the thin silver chain. She fished out the locket and stared at it, the charm shining in the morning light. She rubbed her fingers against the smooth metal and then opened it. A woman looked back at her from the miniature black and white photograph. Sitting with her head tilted toward the camera, dark hair swooping into neat updo, skin flawless, her cheeks shadowed by good bone structure. This was beauty, and it was copied there in the tiny mirror opposite the photo. If Grace squinted, she could almost imagine it was her own reflection, her own features passed down from generation to generation. I'm guessing that picture that she has in her locket that she just looked at, I'm guessing that might be her mother or maybe her grandmother, because it was a black and white photo. That's just my inference there. Okay, moving to page 14. But who was she kidding? She'd never look like that. Never be so thin and elegant. Never be pretty. Grace snapped the locket shut and tucked it back beneath her shirt. Then she dipped her head down, making sure to avoid her reflection this time, as she pulled open the school door and walked inside. The halls bustled around her, charged with their usual rhythm and flow, completely oblivious to her. But there was something different in the air this morning, a crispness that Grace couldn't pinpoint. Then she spotted the flyers tacked up everywhere, the orange papers smoldering along the walls. and she remembered why she had broken out her Elvira t-shirt. It was October 1st. She plucked a flyer off the wall and made her way to her locker, walking absently as she read through the info. The Harvest Halloween Carnival. The high school sponsored the festival every fall. Students put together booths to raise money for their athletic teams and after-school clubs and winter formal. It was open to the whole town, so Grace had gone many times with her dad, every year since her mother. Her breath caught in her throat and a pain lanced into her chest. She pressed the locket underneath her shirt, and its presence grounded her. Kept those lonely thoughts away for now. That does make me think that locket is her mom. She looked back at the flyer and memorized the dates. The carnival always took place the week before Halloween. That was page 14 going to page 15. And while she'd been several times, she'd never gotten to go to opening night, when the carnival was reserved for the high school students only, letting them kick things off with a costumed blowout, minimal adult supervision. This was the first year she'd get to go, and she couldn't wait. Carefully, Grace folded the flyer and bent over. She slung her backpack off her shoulders and slid the piece of paper into one of its pockets. She'd have to figure out a costume, and it'd have to be something good. Something that would make people notice her. Halloween, monsters and ghosts and spooky stuff. It was kind of Grace's thing. In the dark, hidden under a layer of makeup and an over-the-top wig, costume jewelry swinging from her neck and studded her fingers, she could escape. She could be anyone and anything. Zipping her backpack, Grace started to rise but froze halfway. A breath caught in her throat, but this time it was accompanied by a flutter in her stomach instead of a stabbing pain. Up ahead on the stairwell landing, a boy sat all by himself. An outcast like her. A cute one. Calvin Lee. She'd had a crush on him ever since they'd shared a carpool in elementary school, but he hardly noticed her existence anymore. Or anyone's, really. He always had his nose stuck in his notebook, scribbling away, lost in his own world. Not that Grace had noticed it. It wasn't like she'd been watching. Moving to page 16. It wasn't like she'd been watching him for years, waiting for him to say hello, to make a move, to fall in love with her. She shook her head but kept watching Calvin. She knew that it was silly and probably all in her head, but she remembered that day, the day of the accident, the day they'd taken turns standing in front of Alina's grandmother's mirror. Grace had spoken that name, Bloody Mary, into the mirror, and she'd felt a chill run up her spine. She'd seen someone hidden there in the depths of her reflection, recognized Calvin's face, her soulmate, which meant she just had to wait. If she'd seen him, then he must have seen her. They must be destined for each other. "Out of the way!" a voice crackled, ripping Grace out of her fantasy. She stumbled forward and barely managed to spring to her feet without face planting. Clutching her backpack, she turned around and met the glossy lips and perfect blonde hair of her harasser, her former best friend. Former means used to be best friend. "I said move!" Alina waved her sparkly fingernails in front of Grace's face, snapping impatiently. "You're blocking my locker!" The two girls, flanking Alina, had a good giggle as Grace shuffled out of the way. Her shoulders hunched while her ears burned bright. "What are you even wearing?" Page 17. Grace pulled her backpack to her chest to block Elvira's witchy face. "What a freak!" Alina muttered as she threw her bag into her locker and checked her reflection in the mirror she had hanging there. Grace watched as Alina puckered her lips and fluffed her hair. As Alina pulled out a tube of lip gloss and reapplied, in the background of the mirror, Grace caught a glimpse of her own flat brown hair. "She's right. You are a freak." Grace tried to shake the words out of her head. There was a reason she avoided mirrors. She hated what she saw in her reflection. Hated the mean things she couldn't keep herself from thinking. She didn't need someone like Alina telling her she was ugly and a freak. She had the insults covered on her own. "Henry!" Alina gasped, and Grace blinked away from the mirror. She'd been so lost in thought that she hadn't noticed the boy sneaking up behind Alina. He wrapped his arms around her waist and lifted her into the air. Alina wiggled out of the boy's grip and turned to face him. She planted a kiss on his cheek and marked him as hers, leaving a glistening impression with her wet lip gloss. Grace watched the couple for a second and then backed away. If only she could be pretty like Alina, pretty and popular, then she wouldn't be so lonely. And Calvin might notice her, might even ask her out. Her eyes fluttered up to the stairwell landing, but Calvin, page 18, wasn't there. He couldn't have gone far, but as Grace thought about hunting him down, the first bell rang. As she was scrambling up to the stairs, though, a piece of paper caught her eye, lying flat on the floor right where Calvin had been sitting. She bent down to pick it up, and when she turned it over, a strange feeling hiccuped in her chest, a jolt of something sweet. There on the paper was a sketch of what looked like some sort of demon, almost an Elvira look-alike, with its tight dress and dark hair. Its lips were outlined in bright red. A drip of blood ran down its chin. Its eyes were possessed, ghastly. Grace glanced over her shoulders to make sure no one else had seen. Then she whipped a notebook out of her backpack and carefully pressed the sketch in between the pages, keeping it safe and crisp. She felt lightheaded and hopeful as her mind raced and her stomach flipped, because maybe she and Calvin had something in common after all. Maybe they really were soulmates. Now, Stephen, see if you can tell yourself what just happened in that chapter. And if you can't, go back and reread it. See if you can remember what happened 5 years ago when they looked in the mirror that connects Calvin and Grace. See if you can think about how Alina is treating Grace, and maybe why, and what happened to Grace's mother. And if you don't remember, we can look back at that. Or I think it even mentioned in here what happened. What's another good question? Oh, how does Alina treat Grace? And who do we think Henry is? And was Henry there in the beginning? I feel like he was. I don't have the book to look back on. But I feel like Henry might have been one of the ones that looked in the mirror in the beginning. We might want to look back at that too. And now they're freshmen in high school, and what are all the flyers around the school telling about, and how does Grace feel about that? See if you can answer some of those questions to yourself, and if not, Go back and find those answers or tell me.